The thermal hulls were being bolted into place at all hours, and by nightfall on the 39th day, the machine was evaluated to be so far along in its construction that it would not even explode if we turned it on. Lovely. A gain in utility for some, a loss for others. A nice explosion to partake in wasn't completely useless in these troubled times. The sky above the camp was darkened by black smoke from the perpetual fires we clung to. 5 days' supply remained. Perhaps the evacuees would come with pockets loaded. Better, perhaps they wouldn't come at all. Life was quiet. The leftover engineers were busying themselves trying to construct a brazier with heavy wheels to port around the site, granting them a superb excuse to be in close proximity to the fires all day. The pleasure house was shut, by the hands of God, they claimed. If the good Lord's hand was so icy, then we'd need comfort girls all the more. Yet we all had to go without. I did make amends with Euphemia, somewhat blindly, on the morning of a most memorable day. We took tea, and I produced an all-purpose apology to salve the unlooked-for divide I might have wrought. She was unexpectedly receptive, and said that I was really a wonderful person, only that I became slightly unusual in my affections as a side effect of the cocaine. I knew she was wrong, but it was a beautifully convincing argument that made me feel leagues better. I vouched for my own integrity and shook her hand in a business-like fashion. I invited her to stay longer, and she adroitly returned the play by offering me a tour of the generator site. I agreed, and Jasper leapt up the moment I reached for my coat. Outside, the mud was striped with ice, and I must have looked a drunken lout with my nimble waddling to traverse it all. It was amusing to me, seeing not the world on account of my hood, just the flailing limbs I had to admit were mine with an embarrassed smile. Then I had a most warming offer. Effie held out her hand. I took it and basked in her upright and sturdy gait as we strode. What a pair we pictured. I was grateful the hood concealed my unhinged countenance during the frolic, but for when Effie peered right in, I think she looked as flush as myself, although in my memory that was how she always looked. I was shaken from within by moods of years gone by, thinking suddenly of Byron. The gentle snow completed the reference to our cavorting on Connaught's grounds when the roads were cut one winter. What further forwardness would I have subjected Effie to had my lunchtime lozenge been ingested already? The same ones that it pained me to harbour when she finally let my hand slip below the towering creation. With Christmas-like flair, the scaffolding was being peeled away by energetic hands. I could feel the faintest heat radiating already, channeled from far below, then wafted out around the ground by the many flaps and wings of the hull. I was compelled to move closer, prompting nervous advice from the overseers to remain clear. Indeed, the scaffolds weren't falling off in the most orderly fashion. In one case, a hand fell close to me. Effie practically lunged at him and addressed him by name. I couldn't see his number as she smothered him. Spying Pen shadowing me at a distance, I had him arrange for doctoring, and swiftly the patient, 180, was ferried off. This left only the grandeur of the scene. Many of the hands were gathering and summoning their associates to take a look at the thing. They were careful to congregate on the landward side, leaving the IEC staff space to join Effie and I below the oversight post. We were looking at a fully installed thermal hull, concealing ingenious workings of power and promise. We might melt the whole camp clean if we'd more than 4 days of coal to live off. A generator of life. Empty but beautiful. A painful reflection. Effie's young friends were crying without any dignity. The seniors fetched stools and produced whatever liqueurs their harassing of the ship crews had netted them. They chortled on the topic of the Americans, cursing them for not keeping their conquests under control. No, the Empire wouldn't permit such unruly volcanism, and we would all be readying ourselves for summer. I stepped in to remind them that, without our predicament, that tenfold raise in IEC pay was hardly likely, and they bawled infectiously. It was a jovial aside, and had me questioning why I'd been so obsessed with attending to my window. Now, I do slightly exaggerate the completeness of this achievement, for certain components remained missing from the full design. There were plans to patch these troubles in various technical capacities, and hence work carried on that very day, both in the engineer's hall and inside the machine itself. Clearly by that stage it was all no particular business of mine. My role, then, became to oversee the completion of the contracts. In several days I would need to sign off on all of the departures so that the hands could bank their fortunes, likely to lose it promptly to one vice or another, and then we'd all go away with another chapter outlined for our memoirs. Achieving the goal required some hurdling, on account of A. the imminent depletion of our coal stores, B. the long journey over the ice with no source of food, C. the social unrest the tall ratio of hands to guards encouraged, and D. that the pots of gold at the end of our trek were purely imaginary. No, I think what I was really going to do was oversee rations until rations were gone, then be the arbiter of fate to decide the precise order in which we should die, until such a time that a small enough party remained to make that 1,000-mile run for Ireland. I had already allotted myself the ease of a randomized list of numbers, such that I could exile the hands in a most apolitical fashion. We'd be out of coal before food by a safe margin, leaving plenty of supply for the return trip. And we hardly needed to worry about it spoiling, did we? A silver lining that the dead decay slower. What effect the stillness had on their souls I would never presume to hypothesize. I shan't belabor these final days to serial length, for you must have deduced from your acquisition of this very piece that I did at some point depart Site 113. Yet thought must be spared for the trial it was to live until that final reprieve, with no knowledge at the time a reprieve was being arranged, simply hope in abundance, although not equally distributed. The sea ice brightened, its deeper blue aspects giving way to the frosting and snow. In duet, the sky dulled and the air withered. We were in a period of twilight most of the day, and I couldn't help but feel that it was a cozy and reassuring arrangement, as if stronger light would only throw our predicament into starker relief. All kept themselves indoors, or indeed inside the generator doing this or that task. We never reached the giddy heights of the original blueprint. However, the various tricks and sleights the engineers brewed up emulated a reasonable portion of its intended effect, untested though it might have been. Our readings gave us an estimate of -45 one day, -50 the next, -55. One was petrified to imagine there was no stable point this was seeking. The natural world does not dip and dive so easily, though, merely seeking its proper temperature with respectable haste. The hands, conversely, were taken in prophecies of doom, so utterly enthralled by the notion that I had to direct the overseers to punish such speech with the batons. Not being entirely cruel, I reminded all that the Lord God was always present to take one's questions on existential matters, although he was also quite content to carry on with his creation if you had nothing in particular to inquire about. In fact, the latter course was ideal, for one could happily empty their mind of questions and concentrate on the burning flames with greater appreciation for the essence of life they exuded. Some were more active and practical in their search for salvation, departing without permission or order to stroll on the sea ice. The rationale, I gather, was to go out and look for the silhouette of a breaker. The view our engineers had from the tower surpassed that which a day's walk on the ice would net, hence we knew it was folly. It was simply a matter of convenience to allow the trips to carry on, for any losses incurred were profitable for those who remained. And it did not seem so monstrous to scheme sacrifices by this method, the lots of luck God lay out. One hand disappeared overnight after such a convenience was exploited, and the search party the next day discovered blood and bear tracks close by. I wondered at what speed the hands could transport our sledges of material. I remain unsure of the speed a bear moves at, although in recent conversation I gathered that it was incomparably greater than a man. This absent factor in our plans may have proven disastrous, and I dare say there are some experiencing that disaster for themselves as this ink rolls onto the page. My nervous napping and wrestles with the stress of befriending Effie again passed me through that half week of purgatory, bringing me to the 45th day. It started brilliantly, with the sky clear and luminous. Whatever had been darkening heaven had passed with the twirls of the weather, granting us a spare 40 Celsius to enjoy, which still left the outdoors thoroughly useless, but the generator's environs were dry and England-like. Then I had word from the tower, the supposedly unmistakable smudge of a ship approaching without care for the ice. Effie was heartbreakingly gleeful at the news. Playing into the mood, I wagered with her that it was some kind of land dreadnought driving on the ice rather than a ship. She immediately bet her entire pay on it, then seemed to be about to withdraw a stake not tasteful between those of such differing means. I, though, secretly placed a bet of my own when I staked my Indian necklace on my dreadnought claim. Of course, it wasn't a dreadnought. It would be a logistical miracle to get them back to England so soon. Thus, 1 hour later, when we'd all had a go looking through the telescope, I presented the white jewelled piece to Effie. She looked like she didn't know what to do with it, so I took the opportunity to set it in place around her neck. She was extremely warm-blooded, I thought. When she closed her thick pullover at the collar, it concealed the main stone of the array, although perhaps that was a better arrangement in such circumstances of flaring envy. She remained vocal in her rejection of the prize, yet it was getting her nowhere. I felt reassured to have the stone tucked away somewhere so dear and so safe. Word of the sightings made its way to the hand camp, prompting a congregation at the dockside. It was a satisfying thing to see the knife-edge vessel push through the ice, its smoke column cutting the sky above almost as finely. The hands were very cheerful, instinctually. Where they thought this ship would deliver them to, God only knows, and I expect he was disappointed with their judgment. Indeed, it was likely the case for many that the homes they pined for had been removed from play in the prior 6 weeks. The efforts we had gone to construct new homes at 113 did not provide the obvious clue as to the upward trend in the land's value. I might have made it my final order that all stay behind for their own good. I was too afraid of it, though, and delegated the task to God, who, as per usual, had a mind of justice over comfort. But I'm getting ahead of myself. In that moment there was a din of happy grunting. The hands took themselves into the bowels of the ship via gangplanks, while the IEC staff made use of the cranes to salvage some of the important equipment. A small crew were to stay behind and tend to the generator. The word from England was that the evacuation was still very much on, so our efforts weren't to be wasted. The icebreaker was captained by a familiar face, the stone-faced slug who had delivered us to Greenland in the first place. I did attempt to hold him to account for misplacing our cargo, but he was able to deftly mumble his way around it all by way of reference to the IEC gentlefolk pulling his strings. I instructed him that this time we were to follow a strict itinerary, depositing the hands and whoever else wished it at Liverpool, then rushing straight to Belfast. The captain nodded, ignoring my revolver once again. After 2 hours, we had trawled the site for good cargo and were ready to depart. 15 staff stayed behind to hold the fort. Some of the hands had the sense to volunteer for this, but it was too late to organize it. Besides, if one was to give deference to official orders, the site was to house the evacuees and them only. My hands were to be returned to the pool. There was one exception. The IEC had magnanimously offered an additional space in the final refuge for one lucky worker, a lottery. I decided to put this off until we were in calmer circumstances, being deluded that I wasn't already in a relative paradise in that regard. Although one thing did improve after my setting foot on that ship, they had bread, a remarkable thing to see after weeks of mostly meat and forage. To set off, the ship's crew scattered mining charges around the nearby ice sheet, then loudly shattered them. This was to allow the ship leeway to turn about, which was an awkwardly slow process, Those left on the docks must have frozen over in their efforts to see us off. Soon we were steaming back to Blighty, redrawing the dark canal through the ice as it attempted to close. I inquired with the ship's crew about how they had even procured the mighty vessel. As I suspected, it was a navy craft on loan. Special orders from above had deemed that our site be recontacted, so that there could be, I believe, a small column of hope in which business as planned could be said to be concluded. Or in other words, we were the only Greenland port with any value left, and saving us avoided a complete washout for the comely gentleman in London whose reputation was pinned to the project. Good for us, or perhaps not. The true worry was the talk of absolute chaos across Britain. I began to fear for my chances of reaching Connaught, long after that train had left the station in truth. The journey lasted 2 days, and I spent most of it sitting in my reasonably outfitted cabin. The captain's cabin it must have been. I could hear the hands singing in the hold below, in between their complaint that it was cold. Cold against the hull of an icebreaker? Must be something in the water, eh? There was a remarkable incident that brought me up to the bridge. It was a sighting on the ice to our east. A black trail was crawling north. The telescopes enlightened us. It was a military march. At the front, 2 insectoid automatons were prodding at the ice with their feet. They were dragging a huge sled the size of a yacht, carrying something long and round below a canvas. The engineers were convinced it was a generator segment of some description. Behind that were snowcats, 10 large and many more small, giving off a wall of black smoke. Their colours couldn't be made out, nor were any hails answered, so we 2 frozen parties passed each other by. It was a sign, though. There were those not giving up on the world, even now. I felt guilty for not staying, briefly, and even mad. I discussed the possibilities with Euphemia, who was certain that the IEC and Royal Society must be pouring everything into these expeditions. She seemed eager to head out again already. I decided to ask if she had any family and the like, worried, of course, that such details would be voluminous and without consequence. It went the other way. She had little she wanted to say of it, only reassuring me, with a smile, that she didn't need to go home, so I shouldn't worry about her. I shouldn't indeed, but we were too late for shouldn'ts in our strange friendship. I shouldn't have let her stay the night, although to banish her to the chill-box cabins along the hall was likely the greater faux pas. She said it was hard to sleep because her metal arm had gotten so painfully cold, sapping her whole body. I ordered Penn to boil us water and produce a cauldron, then I shooed him away. He asked, red in the face, if he should make sure no one came to the door. I snapped at him to be gone before my boots took flight at his head, and added to Effie that I would punish him for his boldness later. Effie was nonplussed as ever. I pooled the water and invited Effie to lower her prosthetic into it. She found it most amusing, and pulled her whole arm out of her shirt to engage with the water further. I decided to look away, for both our sakes. Feeling suddenly ill, I wished passionately to have a cocaine lozenge to hand. I took to the window. We had sped up, I thought, as the ice thinned in more southerly waters. Effie was breathing heavily, with her face almost in the water, then sneezed with a clunk of her prosthetic against the cauldron. I worried what Byron would make of this, my stomach turning to stone. I hoped he hadn't read my letter yet. Effie squeaked a request for a towel, and I fetched it with the dignity of the finest butler, perceiving only my duty. Once she had re-established herself, I aided in the wrapping of the prosthetic with lengths of a rough-spun flag, Russian, I believe. Such were the curiosities a navy captain kept on hand. She reported that she felt better, and I offered her the long couch below the window. She didn't ask for any blankets, taking up her long coat for the purpose. The captain's cot was a turn around the room away, positioned such that I could sit upright and see the window. There was little moonlight, but it was enough to spy the brown of the long coat once the lamp was extinguished. And there I sat, unable to sleep for so many reasons, and unwilling to for reasons more. I was taken by too many thoughts to comprehend, and thought back in horror to how I had treated Effie in my previous encounters. I thought that there could be some truth in that old magazine line of my monstrous affliction of masculinity. It was dour, glum, pickling, and out of place, all this. One thought returned repeatedly, though. The notion that the circumstances dampened the need for such civilized concerns. Ah, what a time to reason oneself into going feral. Should I ask Effie to wake and listen to my ramblings? I almost rose to my feet with that very intention twice. Ridiculous. The darkness was a menacing bedfellow. Fortunately, the sky brightened eventually, and already there was land to be seen. The ordeal was over. Others had seen it too, stirring a clamour below. It is a good thing I savoured that night with Effie, for the outward piece of it was not to be repeated. It was time to face the crashing demise of the Empire, of everything, not knowing what to expect of either the world nor of myself. Whatever I had thought would happen at Liverpool, the truth of it was an order of magnitude worse.